Emotional intelligence, not only does that probably not exist because it's agreeableness, you know how you always hear you need emotional intelligence to thrive in the workplace? It's like, turns out that's exactly backwards. Disagreeable people do better as managers in the workplace. So it's actually, if you lack emotional intelligence, you're more likely to be an effective manager. So an emotional intelligence is a great, indicator of sort of pathology and psychology because it was invented by a journalist. You can't just have some word invented by a journalist and then go make a whole bloody, enterprise out of it. You got to find out if it's really there. And there's not a lot of evidence that it is. And what does it mean anyways? Emotional intelligence. What does that mean? I can infer what you're feeling? Well, is that IQ? Like, are smart people better at that? Or like, am I mirroring you in some way? Or do I care for you? Like, maybe I can figure out exactly what you're feeling and I just don't give a damn. Is that still emotional intelligence? Well, I don't know, right? How would you separate that from sympathy or empathy? And what if you're over-sympathetic to someone? Is that emotional intelligence? Like, maybe you feel way too sorry for your children. So it's like you're all empathetic and all that, but you're not doing them any good. Or sometimes you would be, but sometimes you should say, quit whining, go the hell outside. Because that's the right response sometimes. So these things are not straightforward at all. And of course, emotional intelligence is generally measured with questionnaires. And we know the rule for questionnaires. What's the rule for questionnaires? That's right, exactly. It's measuring one or more of the big five, either well or badly. Okay. So, and as far as I can tell, that doesn't mean that personality has a 5-dimensional structure. I'm not making that argument, because who the hell knows? I don't think it does, likely, although it's very difficult to say. But what the big five theorists have really demonstrated, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you factor analyze questionnaires, what you get looks a lot like a 5-factor structure, and you can do that cross-culturally. And so I think we sort of nailed the question of how are questionnaires structured. So you can't just invent some new thing and term it something and then pretend it's something new without testing it against. And I would test it against IQ, because that bloody thing. We know, for example, IQ eats up most of the variance in disgust sensitivity scales. You'd think, well, why would IQ be related to disgust sensitivity? It's inversely related, by the way. The smarter you are, the less sensitive you are to disgust. Now, I don't know if that's because maybe your cortical inhibition of underlying, like, limbic motivational systems is better. Who the hell knows? We don't know why, but we do know that it's a major predictor. Orderliness also predicts. But the thing about IQ is that it predicts things that you'd never expect. So you should validate your scale against IQ and against the big five, and not some trivial little 10-item measure of the big five either. Because then, if you use 2 questions per trait, you're going to have a lousy measure of the big five, and if your stupid questionnaire predicts over and above that, all that means is that you didn't test it against, you didn't set it up for a good challenge, you set it up for a weak challenge. So, grit, that's very annoying. Yes, that's very annoying, because it's clearly, I think it was correlated, I think I told you this, it was correlated with conscientiousness at 0.75. I don't believe that optimism and pessimism exist. I don't believe that promotion and prevention exist. Empathy, we tried measuring empathy. It's like you can measure empathy like mad if you use 1 measure. But if you use 3, then all of a sudden your empathy measures don't correlate. So that really sucks. So the way out of that is just to use 1 measure, right? Well, obviously not. If your 3 empathy measures don't correlate, well, you got a problem. It's like you have 3 rulers, and you measure something and you get different numbers from each. It's like, really, that's probably, you're either measuring like bubble gum while it's stretching, or there's something wrong with your rulers. So, I don't think psychopathy exists. I think it's low agreeableness and low conscientiousness, because that would make you a predator, that's low agreeableness, and a parasite, because that's low conscientiousness. So that kind of sums up psychopaths. In terms of personality disorders, there was a bunch of them, and over the last 20 years, people have been, the psychometricians in particular, have been trying to cram those things into the big five structure, and they're reaching, they're experiencing a tremendous amount of resistance from the established psychiatric community, and no wonder, but still the big five does seem to be able to provide a pretty good model of what constitutes personality pathology. And that's kind of surprising, because you may remember I told you when the personality measures were first originated, they threw out all the evaluative words, like evil, you know, or bad, or good, for that matter. And, you know, you could imagine that that would attenuate the relationship between personality and psychopathology, because you tend to use more more judgmental words when you're describing psychopathology, like antisocial, for example, which isn't in a personality questionnaire, but which, if it was, would likely load primarily on agreeableness, low. Positive illusions, told you about that already. Practical intelligence, it's like, no, that does not exist, and there's no evidence that it exists. So Sternberg, who has said that part of the reason he was interested in practical intelligence was because he didn't do very well on his GREs. So, you know, he's got this idea that, well, there's a difference between book smarts, and that's sort of you nerdy people, and, like, you know, street smarts, which is like, I don't know, the punk who makes it out in the real world, something like that. And street smarts is like practical intelligence. But the problem is that he never really puts his practical intelligence measures, which really don't exist, up against IQ in a fair head-to-head fight. And he's been just slaughtered for this in the scientific press, especially by Linda Gottfredson, who wrote that paper that I had you guys read on, you know, the complexity of everyday life. Gottfredson, she's a smart cookie, that woman, and she's brave too, you know, because she follows the data where it goes, and she's a very, very clear thinker. She really gave Sternberg a couple of good whacks, and he certainly deserved it. Multiple intelligences, you've heard about that, I imagine. What are they? Sensory, motor, kinesthetic, emotional, I don't remember. What's that? Interpersonal, yeah. Those aren't intelligences. First of all, A, who knows if they exist, and B, we had a perfectly good word for them, which was talent. It's like you can't just take a word, you know, like that's been studied for 100 years, like intelligence, which has a very, very specific definition, more specific than anything social scientists measure, right? So if you believe in social science at all, you have to take IQ into account. He just swipes the word, says, oh, well, everybody wins. You know, it's like, yeah, people have talents. Fair enough, you know, and they're not trivial. But to call them intelligences, and then he also says, when people harass him about his concepts, he says, well, I don't really believe in measurement. It's like, okay, that's fine, except if you're not going to believe in measurement, then what are you doing? It's not science. It might be, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's educational philosophy or something like that. But it's not science. And so it's 20 years later with his multiple intelligence theories, and there's been no published measures of them. And whenever people have tried to measure them and set them up head-to-head against, say, intelligence plus personality, intelligence and personality just eats them up. And so, you know, multiple intelligence theory had a big effect on educational theory. You know, it's like, well, every child should have the opportunity to develop their own particular form of intelligence. It's like, yeah, well, that's great, except you can't measure it. We don't know if it exists, and even if it does, you don't know how to develop it, and you haven't shown that you can develop it. And you haven't shown that you're not doing harm by, you know, pretending that these things exist and act as if that's actual knowledge. So, things that might exist. Well, I told you about these already. Well, there's lots, you know, I talked to you a lot about the big five, you know, but personality isn't that great a predictor of individual behavior, because people are very variable in their behavior from situation to situation. So the best you ever get out of a personality measure is about 0.3 or maybe about 0.4. That was discovered in 1968. There was a big hubbub about that made by Walter Mischel, who said, well, personality scales, they give you 0.2, 0.3, that's like 9% of the variance at best, so what about the other 90%, and why are we chasing such a trivial amount? And that killed personality research stone dead for till 1992. So for that's 24 years, I believe. Because everybody went, oh yeah, these are trivial effects, but then no one ever looked to see what the effects were in all the rest of psychology. Because it turned out that 0.2 and 0.3 is about on the upper end of the effects that you get in most forms of psychology, and so that even if it isn't that great, it's as good or better than whatever one else is doing. And so then there were also economic analysis, which I'll show you later, done in the 1990s that showed that because human variability in productivity is so great, especially on the Pareto distribution, that you don't need very accurate predictors for them to be extremely useful economically. Because the question might be, you know, like, so you're paying your employee $50,000 a year, and you can you could potentially pick an employee that was 1 standard deviation above the mean higher than average on conscientiousness. So with some bad measure, you know, so over 10 employees you'd get an average of 1 standard deviation higher, something like that. The real question is, well, what's the economic return on that? And the answer is, well, because people are so variable in their performance, when some people do, like, they're crazily productive and others are like, they actually detract from the function of the organization, that they figure about 40% of managers add negative net value to the companies they work for. So it's like the productivity line doesn't end at 0. It's like, if you're a particularly bad manager, you can be sucking money out of the enterprise like mad. Well, it turns out that even small predictors have huge economic value. So even though they're not that good, the amount that they are good is better than interviews, for example, by quite a substantial margin.